What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video, and today we're going to be diving into the standard format. As we all know, we have the regional championships taking place in Minneapolis, Minnesota and Hartford, Connecticut coming up in May, and while we have plenty of time to cover some of the usual suspects of the format, I do want to highlight kind of an old friend, someone who towards the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025 looked to be a very solid deck and at one point was considered to be one of the best decks in the format and has kind of reclaimed that spot, even if for a single tournament here. So today we're going to be taking a look at the Dimir midrange deck for the standard format and seeing some of the changes that it's made and kind of the way that it's leaning into, the way it's being built, because obviously this was once one of the most popular decks in the format, this and Golgari midrange. They both kind of fell off a cliff. Golgari midrange has kind of seen an uptick in play, and of course, so has the Dimir midrange deck. So I definitely wanted to cover this one today because if you've seen videos on like the Casual Spikes podcast from back then, or even on this channel here, I absolutely love the Dimir midrange deck. I thought it was, one of the best mid-range decks to play. It solved a lot of the problems that mid-range decks typically have, where Golgari is definitely more in that typical mid-range where you're trying to extract as much value as you can. You can do the same thing here, but you're also able to kind of keep up on raw cards, kind of something akin to the domain decks, which can do it a little bit more consistently, but I think Dimir is just a little bit more explosive, if you can believe that. But of course, before we get too deep into the deck and we talk about the Dimir mid-range deck today for the standard format, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where we talk mainly about the modern standard format, as well as some other longer form videos for your viewing pleasure. So if anything that interests you, again, please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know when future videos get posted. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content. And if you'd like to support me even further, you can go down in the description down below, where you will not only find the deck list for this deck hanging out down there, but you'll also find a link to my Discord server, a link to our Twitch channel over at twitch.tv/Crawdaddy23, and of course, the Casual Spikes podcast that I had just mentioned, where me and my co-host Randy over at MTG with Randy talk about anything and everything to do with competitive Magic. We talk about metagame breakdowns. We go over some of the major competitive events going on and kind of try to break down that information and try to set you up success for your next regional championship qualifier or regional championship. So if that's something that interests you and you want even more content, go ahead and subscribe over to the Casual Spikes podcast. Lastly, I would like to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. If you use my code in the description down below, you will get 5% off your monthly subscription, which will allow you to rent decks such as this one on Magic Online to compete in different challenges and different events going on Magic Online, so that you could potentially qualify for the next Pro Tour. So I would like to thank Manatraders again for being a sponsor of the channel. Now let's go ahead and talk about this Dimir midrange deck. So what I kind of expected a deck like this to do is to kind of build more into playing its best card, and the best card, far none, in this Dimir midrange deck is Kaito, Bane of Nightmares, a card that we talked about, early on in Duskmoor previews. I thought it was really cool that we have like a Planeswalker that has like a ninjutsu design, and I just think that this card was, is pretty powerful, where like the +1 really wasn't going to be all that great. Turns out that just Kaito giving itself +1/+1 and that really being it is just plenty good enough. A 0 that gets you some card advantage with a little bit of selection there as well. In the very worst case, to set up for your next draw step. And then a -2 that taps a creature, puts 2 stun counters on it, is very annoying, locks down the best threat while also being able to get in damage, potentially also protecting Kaito. So you can get to that point where you can grow Kaito to get a little bit bigger, close out games that way, and of course it gets some extra card advantage going. This has been absolutely one of the best Planeswalkers, probably from the last 6 months to a year, I would say. Ugin's probably going to be the only one to really rival that. I don't think it's going to see much play in Standard personally, but in Modern, for sure, and a lot of the Eldrazi ramp decks that we are seeing around the format. And, I didn't think they were that popular, but I'm just always running into them when I play on Magic Online. But Kaito, definitely up there as well, is making a huge splash in Standard. It's one of the best Planeswalkers, and probably just the best Planeswalker, and one of the best cards to be playing in Standard currently. And on top of that, too, we do see it in some of the blue-black variants of, these mid-range decks and some of these other like Frog Tide type decks in Modern as well. So needless to say, Kaito has been very impactful, and this Dimir deck has definitely leaned in on the fact that this is a very powerful Planeswalker that you can play as early as turn 3 as long as you have an unblocked creature. So how are we doing that? Well, this deck has upped its count to 6 1-drops, specifically in this deck, with Fairy Dream Thief being a 2 of and Spyglass Siren being a 4 of. So Fairy Dream Thief may be a card that most players aren't necessarily familiar with. I definitely definitely had to read this card. So a 1-mana, 1/1 flying creature that when it enters the battlefield, you Surveil 1, and then you can pay 2 and a black and exile it from your graveyard to draw a card, and you lose 1 life. So this is a card that at most stages of the game is going to be very good. A 1-mana, 1/1 flyer, this is essentially going to up your flyer count to make it easier for you to have an unblocked creature that you can then ninjutsu with Kaito, and it also has an enter the battlefield ability, which is something that you can kind of abuse with the ninjutsu ability by having to pick up said creature to put the Kaito into play. So this one in particular, allowing you to Surveil 1, so you kind of get some instant value, where Spyglass Siren is the better creature. It could potentially make your creature even bigger, draw you a land, whatever the case may be. It gives you access to that card right then, where you're either know that you're going to draw this card next turn, or you're putting a land in your hand, potentially giving yourself future land drops, which we all know mid-range decks love to make their land drops, or you can just kind of, again, move past it and potentially hit more spells or even draw another land. Whatever the case may be, you're not stuck drawing a land for turn. You have the higher potential to draw spells, and of course grow your creature. Of course you can kind of get blown out if your opponent kills the creature that you are trying to target with the map token, but overall Spyglass Siren is the better of the two flyers, but the fairy does give you kind of that immediate value where Spyglass Siren is not so immediate, on turn 1. But 6 1-mana 1/1 flyers is very potent, and especially a really good way to make sure that your Kaito does kind of come down on turn 3, and you leverage that very powerful Planeswalker. Now, in the 2-drop spot, we have Deep Cavern Vat, and we have Flood Pitch Drowner. So Flood Pits is really nice because if you look down here with all these other spells, we have a good amount, with 3 Go for the Throat, 1 Anoint with Affliction, 2 Phantom Interference, and 4 Cut Down here. We do have some ability to leave up mana and potentially, play like removal spells. So this Flood Pitch Drowner fits in kind of well with these spells. You just play your second land. There's a million different things that you can represent. Flood Pitch Drowner just being a flash thing where if your opponent's trying to get aggressive, you just come down, tap the creature, you put a stun counter on it, and this, of course, is another creature that your opponent has a hard time trying to kill and interact with on the early turns of the game that can easily set up that Kaito and allow you to be proactive, leave up mana potentially where, if you're worried about locking down the creature more so, you can play the Flood Pitch Drowner, or you can just leave up mana and, Phantom Interference, your opponent's next spell, or play the Anoint with Affliction or Go for the Throat if it's more advantageous than playing the Flood Pitch Drowner. But, with being Flash and Vigilant, you're able to also get an attack with it, and if the creature is that big of an issue, you can then pay 2 and then shuffle the Flood Pitch Drowner and a creature with a stun counter into his owner's library. You also don't necessarily have to do it with the creature that you tap with Flood Pitch Drowner. You could just play Flood Pitch Drowner, lock down your opponent's creature, get an attack, flash in Kaito, rather ninjutsuing Kaito off of any one of your other creatures, and then Flood Pitch Drowner will be able to, at a later point, shuffle that creature back into the library. So definitely some decent synergy there with Kaito, so it ends up making it a pretty attractive creature option there as well. With Deep Cavern Bat being a 2-mana 1/1 flying lifelink creature that's going to look at your opponent's hand, and you can exile a non-land card from it until Deep Cavern Bat leaves the battlefield. So it's going to allow you to take a removal spell out of your opponent's hand, or they have to then kill the Deep Cavern Bat if they don't want you to take the removal spell, but then you're still going to get the information, kind of what's in the hand, and of course information is key in competitive Magic. And in the worst case, if your opponent ends up wasting a removal spell on the Deep Cavern Bat, well, they're not using it on your other kind of heavy hitters here, where we go into Preacher of the Schism and Tashawn's Tiebinder, only a 2 of and a 1 of respectively. Preacher of the Schism is a pretty unique card, where 3-mana 2/4 Death Touch, that whenever it attacks, if a player with the most life or tie for the most life, if attacks the player with the most life. So if your opponent is at 19 and you're at 18, you will then get to make a 1/1 vampire token with lifelink. If Preacher of the Schism attacks and you have the most life, or you're tied for the most life, you draw a card and lose 1 life. And if you and your opponent are stay both at 18 and Preacher attacks, you can then stack it to where you can make a token, and then you can also draw a card and lose life there as well. So you kind of get the best of both worlds there. A really interesting card, and with your deck doing damage in really like multiples of 1 and 2, it's kind of easy to get you and your opponent's life totals to kind of match up to maximize the amount of value. Of course, you're not necessarily really worried about getting full value out of every single Preacher attack. There's going to be points in the game where you're just fine with drawing the extra card, and again, making it a lot harder for your opponent to actually be able to interact with you, or at least be able to keep up when you're 1-for-1ing them the whole time, but then you're also drawing 7 to 10 extra cards that you don't care that you're necessarily going 1-for-1. You can afford to 1-for-1 with some of your more expensive spells, because you're just keeping up a lot better on just raw cards and raw resources than what your opponents are doing. Tashawn's Tiebinder is a 1 of. 3 mana, 3/2 with flash. Whenever it enters the battlefield, counter up to one target activated or triggered ability. If it's an artifact, creature, or planeswalker, is countered this way. That permanent loses all abilities for as long as the Shadow Tiebinder remains on the battlefield. It's kind of a way that you can counter opposing Kaitos. They go to activate their ability, go ahead, counter the ability, and now their Kaito just doesn't work anymore. Getting to turn off powerful artifacts and or creatures are really nice, and just being a way to counter a target activated or triggered ability, even if it doesn't come from any an artifact, creature, or a planeswalker, can still be very powerful because you can get a lot of tempo of just negating that triggered ability while also just putting a 3/2 into play, applying more pressure. And then finally at our top end, we have 4 Enduring Curiosity. This card has been an absolute house in these Dimir strategies since the release of Duskmourn. So a 4 mana 4/3 with flash. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, and if it dies, return the creature. Return it to the battlefield if it was a creature under your control and it's an enchantment and it's no longer a creature. This essentially gives you a Biden Thassa effect with legs, and it doesn't care that, if you deal damage with like 5 creatures, you're drawing 5 cards. If you deal damage with 2 creatures, you're drawing 2 cards. And this is where this deck can definitely get out of hand. While we would see Enduring Curiosity paired with something like Shieldred, which we do see 1 Shieldred in the sideboard, to kind of like gain a ton of life and really kind of put your opponent away, where, also if your opponent has an Enduring Curiosity going and you have a Shieldred, you're going to punish them pretty heavily for dealing combat damage to you, so you kind of race them on 2 different axes there. But this card has been absolutely amazing. Obviously fell off once the Dimir decks kind of fell off, and it felt like it was kind of slow. But with the kind of the rise in some of the mid-range decks and some of the more exile-based removal, it seems like Enduring Curiosity is kind of finding its way back into the format, just again by being a really reactive like flash creature that, again, even if you only get to get 1 attack step in with it and you get to draw 3 or 4 cards, like you're kind of fine with a 4 mana draw 4, which also means that you got him for damage and things like that. We went through some of the removal spells. One of the other big ones here is a 1 of Gix's Command, 5 mana, and you can put 2+1/+1 counters up to 1 creature. It gains lifelink until end of turn, which can allow you in like some of the burn matchups where you can just wipe your opponent's board, destroy each creature, power 2 or less, or you can make them sacrifice a creature with the highest power. Put +1/+1 counters on your creature, making it even bigger and getting in a pretty big attack, and then also getting some life along the way there. You can also return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. So this is like a card that is pretty good against like the other mid-range matchups. You get to make your opponent sacrifice their biggest creature. You also get to return 2 of your creatures from your graveyard to your hand, meaning that this is like kind of pseudo card advantage. Or against some of the other smaller decks, you can just use the other mode to destroy all creatures of power 2 or less, and then put 2+1/+1 counters on up to 1 target or on up to 1 creature, gains lifelink until end of turn. You don't have to even target the creature as well. So if your opponent has a removal spell in response to the Gix's Command and you wanted to say put it on a Deep Cavern Bat, they kill it, well, then you can go target a Flood Pitch Drowner with it, and all those things work out. And as well as if you end up picking those first 2 modes as well, kind of a fun fact, you put the counters on a creature and then it destroys all creatures power 2 or less. So as long as you're putting them on a 1 power creature, those 2+1/+1 counters, it won't end up actually getting swept away, and you'll actually get to keep the creature around. So it's like a way that you can kind of protect one of your other smaller like flyers, while also wiping your opponent's board as well, which is really neat. The mana base, pretty straightforward. There's 1 Fountain Port and 2 Soulstone Sanctuary and 2 Restless Reef as kind of like these like utility-ish lands. Then you have the play sets of Gloomlake Verge, 4 Islands, 4 Swamp, 4 Underground River, and 4 Darklit Shores as just, your mana sources. Sideboard, we see Duress, Ghost Vacuum, Spell Pierce, 3 steps ahead, Annoy with Affliction, Negate, Blot Out, Malicious Eclipse, 2 more Tashawn's Tiebinder, Urtai Resurrected, Shielded the Apocalypse, and 1 more Gix's Command here. And I'm kind of surprised, honestly, that we don't see the Fairy Mastermind here, because this is a card that a lot of Dimir players really liked because it was just another 2 mana flash threat. I could definitely see a world where it's maybe not necessarily that good when you have a lot of Dimir mid-range playing just 1 toughness flyers, and getting to trade your 1-drop for their 2-drop is just like for you is exciting if you're the one playing Fairy Dream Thief or Spyglass Siren. Don't know why that was such a tongue twister, but when you're playing like those creatures and your opponent flashes in a Mastermind, you're kind of okay if they attack into your 1/1, because then they're either gonna have to use a removal spell, which kind of comes at a premium when you have other creatures in here that are just a lot more impactful than a Spyglass Siren or a Dream Thief, unless you're trying to specifically keep a Kaito off the battlefield. But or they just kind of accept the trade, and again, you traded your 1-drop for their 2-drop, which is again is very good, very much I would say in your favor. But yeah, that's the Dimir midrange deck for the standard format. Overall, it's a deck that I mean, I've always been a big fan of these mid-range decks. I think that Dimir mid-range solves a lot of the problems that mid-range decks have, which is just, eventually they try to 1-for-1 and 2-for-1 you enough to where they kind of slam a big threat, and then they're able to kind of haymaker you out of the game, sort of kind of how these ramp decks do it. But obviously their creatures fit into more of a game plan where they can be aggressive and they can also be pretty defensive. They can help you get to the late game, or they can close out games very quickly if your opponent stumbles. And I think that this deck, while is definitely death by 1,000 cuts, you're just going to get hit by a bunch of 1 and 2 power things, maybe even a 3-power Kaito. But eventually, with Enduring Curiosity, and they end up drawing 5, 10, 15 cards, that's just a game that you are not going to win as the opponent, and you kind of have to suck it up and come back and play the next game hopefully fairly well. But how well this Dimir mid-range deck is going to hold up is definitely going to depend on how much of the aggro decks that we see in the coming months, or excuse me, in like the coming month, with the release of Tarkir Dragonstorm actually happening this past weekend. So we're going to be rolling in and getting some deck lists here soon, I'm sure, of some of the cards that are now legal in Standard, and see if we can shake up any of the metagame before we get to the regional championships for Standard in Minnesota and in Connecticut. But of course, if you are wanting to see any of that stuff and kind of our build up to the Standard Regional Championships, be sure to subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, all that fun stuff. Go ahead, check out the deck list in the description below. Check out the Twitch channel, check out the Casual Spikes podcast, all that stuff in the description down below. I do greatly appreciate it, and I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.